Good afternoon, everyone. I am Reverend Sherry L. Jackson, based in Alexandria, Louisiana. And tonight we are continuing our study in the book of Exodus, studying Exodus 11 and 12 specifically tonight as we focus on the 10th plague, or the death of the firstborn. But before we get there, I wanted to review to help us to put into context tonight's lesson and how it fits into the whole scheme of things, what these plagues were all about. But before we get to the plagues, we understand that we even got to this point because there was a need in the Hebrew community. Whereas, we're finished Joseph. Joseph has died, and his family, Jacob's family, has multiplied, and so much so that the Egyptians, Pharaoh, determined that they needed to put these people under subjection so that they would not overtake them. And Moses was chosen to be the person that was going to bring them out of slavery. Moses was chosen in the midst of all of the chaos of all of the baby boys being killed at birth, but his mother saw the need or wanted to preserve him. Now that's going to be interesting right in itself. Pharaoh had a family planning system that he was going to kill off the firstborn. And then tonight we come full circle, and God is going to allow a plague that is going to kill off the firstborn. Now that is going to be really interesting, and I believe that there is something really important to be said about the firstborn, and we're going to deal with that a little bit tonight. We do know that Moses was called, commissioned, and sent. We went through a whole process of learning what it means to be chosen, to be called, to be commissioned, to be sent, that God takes the initiative to call us, that we don't call ourselves. And even when God calls us, we usually have a whole lot of excuses of why we can't go, why we can't do. And Moses gave us a good pattern of what I call the call narrative. God calls, God gives the divine confrontation. Moses was minding his own business, remember, minding the sheep, when God disrupted his routine. And that's usually the way God does. He disrupts our routine to get our attention. But at the end of the day, Moses was called, commissioned, and sent with one purpose in mind. He had to confront Pharaoh, and his whole object was to get the people, God's people, out of bondage. And at the end, when we get to Deuteronomy, we will see that when Moses has completed his purpose, he dies. And so I wanted to give Pastor Green an opportunity to get in right here, because there are some things that he wanted to tell us last week that he did not get a chance to tell us, particularly about the gods. Now remember, I told you that Egypt was a polytheistic community or culture. There was no such thing as worshiping one God. There were many gods. And so Yahweh, God, is trying to get them to understand that he is the only God that they needed. There was a group of about 8 gods that they had, and we went through those last week, that ruled over nature, that ruled over the crops that rule the sun, the weather. And so each one of these plagues challenged one of Egypt's gods, because God wanted to show that I am bigger than any of the gods that you have. And so tonight, when we get to the 10th plague, all of the gods will be challenged at once. Before, it was one plague per god, so to speak. But the 10th plague, all of the gods will be challenged. And so with that said, I want to give Pastor Green an opportunity now to elaborate a little bit. Pastor Green.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. I'm so glad you've been forgiven for muting me out.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. But one of the things I wanted to point out for us last week, and it's good anytime, is that God had told Pharaoh to let his people go in no uncertain terms. But the way this thing come to be is better if we take it step by step. Abraham, whom God called, God told Abraham, you will sojourn in a land for over 400 years, then they will come back to Bethlehem, Bethel, the Judean community. God told Abraham that he had no children. So as history unfolds and you walked us through the family, and Abraham had a boy, then another boy, and another boy, then Isaac had twins, and the Joseph story you took great pain to bring us through it. God's purpose is going to be accomplished no matter how long it takes. Abraham's is going to be in foreign land for 400 years. Joseph was sent before them, as you pointed out, to brothers. They meant it for harm. God get Joseph to Egypt, where Joseph saved and protected the lives of his siblings. 70 of them went into Egypt, and Pharaoh gave Joseph's family the choice land, best land, everything they wanted. But as history unfolds, the word you pointed out to us a few weeks ago, it said, there arose a Pharaoh. Anytime a people or person lose their history to understand their foundation, so as the events unfold, Pharaoh was concerned about these Hebrews multiplying so fast they will outnumber us in our own land. Should they side with the enemy, and we become the slaves and they take over. He increased their work, the hard taskmasters. Of this story, as you pointed out to, and I want all of us to capture this, God made a promise to Abraham. It wasn't until Pharaoh put pressure on the Hebrews that they began to call on God. Moses have killed one, gone to Midian, his business as a shepherd with his father-in-law's flock and his. The children of Israel is back in Egypt talking to God. God is using this wireless communication form to give Moses a hot spot called a bush. And so Moses started talking to the bush. The fun of that story is, God said, I've heard the prayers of my people, and I have come down to deliver them. Moses, I'm sending you to Pharaoh. I hope and pray, partakers in this ministry of God, that we understand the big picture. Somebody is praying in another section of the world. God is working on somebody here to prepare them. Moses come to see Pharaoh, And last week we walked through 9 of the plagues. The first 3 involved everybody, all being turned to blood, the night with the frogs, ice. Everybody was affected by those first 3. And the fun part is, every time the magicians tried to mimic Moses, they made it worse. They made more frogs, more nets, more flies, more snakes. So, by the time we get to plague number 4, challenging the gods of Egypt, but the flies did not affect flies. Flies was affected. They affected the Egyptians. So from plague 4 through 9, it was only the Egyptians that was affected by the plagues. Gods were challenged. Gods could not hold a candle to Yahweh. So we worked through the flies, the disease on the cattle, the boils on the destruction of the crop, hail, and then all the hail didn't kill, the locusts killed. Days of darkness. 3 days of darkness was a direct challenge to the sun god. Made it through that section in chapter 9. And is where we will start focus on death of the firstborn, but chapter 10, 11, and 12. Osiris, if we remember the Egyptian god Osiris, that was that god that gives life. Pharaoh was considered deity himself. The God gives life, sustains life, protects life. But today, we're about the challenge. Moses is about the challenge. Ultimate God. The way it's going to happen, step by step, is it's told in these 2 chapters. But the fun part is, make up his mind about something and see another outcome, he change and alter the plan. We need to be careful when we alter our plans, and does not interfere with God's plan. 9. Number 10, Osiris is about to be challenged today, and that's tonight. My prayers for all of us is that we carve on our mind the word Passover. That means that we carve on our mind that this is a deliverance, a physical deliverance, and not spiritual. Don't try and spiritualize exodus and deliverance of God's people. Appreciate you letting me in tonight. Now I'll be paying close attention, and I'll be able to come in again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing us up today. Are there any questions up at this point that you want to ask about the first 9 plagues, or anything that you've read up until this point, anything that we've talked about? You may ask them now, or you may send them by chat if you do not feel comfortable asking them out before we go to the 10th plague. Okay, well, hearing none, as Pastor Green has said, that up until all of this point, these first 9, Pharaoh, he would tell them he was going to let them go, and then he would change his mind. He would tell them he was going to change his mind. And so each plague got more and more severe, or more and more drastic. And so this last sign, or this last plague, is going to change everything. And this time, everybody has to be prepared. Now, what I told you earlier was that all of the gods are going to be challenged by Yahweh. Up until this point, it was only the 9th plague was when everything got dark, but there was a challenge to the sun god, or to Ra, which was really a challenge to Pharaoh himself. Remember, Pharaoh was considered a deity. So when Moses comes talking about Yahweh said, or the I am says, let my people go. Well, who is this I am that's challenging Pharaoh, a God, to let Pharaoh's people go? Because at the end of the day, the Israelites were slaves under Pharaoh. And so this 10th plague, or the death of the firstborn, is going to challenge all of the gods. The 10th plague is a totality of the plague, and it is the beginning of what we were going to call, or what is known as, the Passover tradition. And so if you've read 11:1 all the way to the end of chapter 12, you will know that this plague was on the Israelites and the Egyptians. And the plague consisted of the firstborn being killed on a certain night. Now, remember earlier we said that Pharaoh himself earlier on was trying to get rid of the Egyptians by having the firstborn killed. Remember, he told them that when to kill off all the baby boys, to kill off. And so, and then when that didn't work, because the midwives said, you know, look, these Hebrew women, they strong women. By the time we get there, the baby's already there. And so then Moses said, okay, I'm not Moses. Pharaoh said, well, since they're already here, take them. Once they come, take them to the river and drown them and put them in water. And lo and behold, that's how Moses was saved. And so, in order that the way to avoid the punishment of the people was to kill a sacrificial lamb and paint the doorposts of the house with the blood of the lamb. And when the Lord passed through the land, he would not kill the firstborn of the houses that had shown their trust in his provision of salvation. Now, what's interesting in, if all of the firstborns were going to be killed, that meant that Pharaoh's son was also killed, as well as many of the children of the Egyptians. So they feared themselves to be the next killed, and gave all they could to get the children of the Israelites out of the land, because it started affecting their household. And that's how, you know, I'm not going to put too much shade on them, because remember, we don't usually act until it affects our household, or affects something that belongs to us, our loved ones. It's always the people over there, or those people, until it affects our household. But the question becomes, why the firstborn? What was so important about the firstborn? Does anybody want to take a stab at that? What was so important about the firstborn? Why? What? Just think about it. It doesn't. It's not such a spiritual answer, so to speak. But why do you think? Remember, if you go back, there were certain rights tied to the first. Remember, a whole lot of problems happened between Jacob and Esau, and Isaac and Ishmael, because of the first son, of the firstborn. The older is supposed to have gotten certain rights and privileges that was switched up, and the second got, and that caused a lot of problems. So why do you think, what is so important about the firstborn? I'll open that up to you tonight.
firstborn of
Not
male.
Pastor Green. Not Pastor Green. Not Pastor Green.
Okay.
Dr. Fred Jones. Dr. Fred Jones.
Yes, ma'am.
What would be so important about the firstborn? Why do you think it was that God or they was going to affect the firstborn? What's significant about the firstborn? Even just think about in your own household.
Well, I'm going to take a stab and say that it has something to do with the law of first mention.
Okay, what are you? Explain that a little bit.
When we see a scripture or a principle in the Bible for the first time, generally it is then seen or explained in its purest form. And therefore, any other mentions or explanation of that term or concept will align or support that first mention. So I would think that the firstborn has something to do with the family identity.
Okay, that's you're on it.
And that's about as far as I'm gonna go, teacher.
Okay, anybody want to help or add on to what Fred is talking about? It does have something to do with family identity.
Well, I'm not really sure. I'm trying to think this thing through, and I guess when I think about Pharaoh's firstborn, that he would inherit all of his father's riches, or however they titled it, that he would have access to everything that his father owned.
That's right. That's right. So good. You're on the right trail. Remember the firstborn, and if Pharaoh was considered a god, a little God, what would his son, if his son was going to take everything from his dad, then that would make him be what? A god also. He would have the same position as his father. So that's in Pharaoh's household. And so when you take the firstborn, your strength, you're taking the strength, a nation's strength, and the family line is weakened. So with the idea of the fact that Pharaoh's son was going to also be killed, and it was not every firstborn that's already grown and already got children and all things like that, but it's the children who are infants, who are small, who have not had an opportunity to produce children, because the idea was to get to kill off the seed, so to speak, to kill off the seed. So remember Pharaoh, as Fred has talked about, the law of the first mention, and what that is, a principle of the law of the first mention is wherever you first saw something or wherever it was first mentioned, then if you go back to it, you will get the principle of the concept. So the first time that we heard or talked about the firstborn was in when Pharaoh was trying to get rid of the Hebrews. He was trying to kill them all. And so it is the same exact thing. And this was in Exodus 1:15 through 22. So we would have to go all the way back. So you are right in saying that it had something to do with family identity. It had something to do with weakening the family. And even today, if we kill off the boys, if we weaken, the way that we can weaken the family is to weaken the boy, because the seed comes through the male. And so if you could do that, you can take out the family. And that's exactly what Pharaoh did. And in a sense, that's what this plague did, because the Egyptians have to be stopped. And so because it is now affecting Pharaoh's house, so to speak, or weakening his bloodline, we're going to see a major shift. In fact, this time Pharaoh is going to insist that they leave. So we'll keep going on that. But so good discussion. You're exactly right. It is to weaken the family. So this time, God is going to deal with Pharaoh directly. Remember, all the other times, Moses and Aaron had served as mediators. And remember that Aaron was around with Moses because Moses had said that he could not go along because of his speech impediment. And so Aaron was there. It was Moses's job, but God allowed Aaron to be with him as a support system. Even though God has called us for particular jobs, commissioned us and sent us for particular jobs, we may bring all kinds of other people. As my brother told me at my party, I like to have an entourage, but at the end of the day, the task is mine, or the task is yours, whatever God has called you to do. So Aaron was only a support system, but all the other plagues, the first 9, God allowed Moses and Aaron to speak on his behalf. But this time it was such that God was going to deal with Pharaoh directly. In other words, it was going to be God against God. Big G versus little g. But Pharaoh himself thought he was a big G also. So we got Yahweh against Pharaoh. After the plague of the darkness felt throughout the land was lifted, then Pharaoh went back to his old ways and trying to bargain with God and offer Moses a deal. And the deal was that, okay, Moses, you can go, you can take your people, but the animals have to stay here. Because remember, Moses wanted to take the people, the animals, so they can go out and sacrifice, do their sacrifices and worshiping of Yahweh. But remember, at the same time, all the animals in Egypt had been affected. So Pharaoh said, okay, you guys can go, but the animals have to stay here. But Moses said, no, we gotta take everybody, because it all belongs and it all is for God, Yahweh, Egypt. So he tries to bargain with God. Is unacceptable. God is not willing to take this. And so Moses gets enraged. He gets beside himself. And he basically tells the people, get thee from me, get away from me. You're not going to see my face anymore. And Moses said, well, you're all right, because about midnight will I go into the midst of Egypt. This is what God said. And all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sits on the throne all the way down to the maidservants, those all the way down to the beasts. So everybody is going to be affected, And there is going to be a great wail, a great cry when this takes place. Pastor Green.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you trying to get in?
I tried, and I say, Lord, I don't know whether I'm trying in vain. The thing I want to remind us of, it's in the firstborn, even Pharaoh's firstborn. Responsibility of being the priest in the family, the person to establish the family. That's why the double portion of the birthright was given to for Social Security. Just to live, and there was no other benefits except what the family could provide.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, marriage was a way of protecting the family and growing the family and creating wealth and creating all. The firstborn role is vital to the well-being and welfare of the family. Move that person out could be chaos. I was in Ghana a few years ago, and the king died, had children by both mothers, two different women, and each one had a firstborn. That night, 26 people were killed. Serious business, what you just mentioned a while ago. Cyrus can't do this. This is nobody but Yahweh. The position he put Moses in, and what you said earlier, is a powerful position. Because at this time, it is between God and God. And so Moses is taking back. That's known instruction. And I pray and thank God that as the Israelites obeyed Moses' instruction, that he preached the gospel so plain and clear that being the word of God. Don't make it plain. If Moses would have made it plain and they would have not put their blood on their mantle and doorposts, or some of them have been good Baptists, I'm not going to mess up my nice house, put no blood on my house. Moses don't know what he's talking about. Wrong 9 times. So what's to make him not be wrong on the 10th time? The eye opener. Will you bring this to us that we can bridge the gap?
Thank you so much, Pastor Green, for filling in for us. Are you talking about speakerphone tonight?
I am.
Okay,
is that what it is? Can you hear me better now?
It keeps going in and out. It's kind of like a delay. So don't use your speakerphone.
I think my lines are full of water. We had a little shower over the weekend.
Okay.
It's a landline.
All right. So what we're at the point where up until this point, Israel just kind of like was standing in the background and God was doing all the work. And so now God is going to require that they no longer be passive, but they have to actually be active in their obedience. They were kind of like on the sidelines watching all of this going down. But this time, God is demanding that they do something. And they are given strict instructions to follow so that they do not also feel the judgment of this last plague sent by the Lord. Yes, sir? And so now they could be affected if they don't follow the rules. And in chapter 12, and we're going to read a little bit of that in chapter 12, you're going to see that God had given them some specific instructions. And these instructions institute what we call the Feast of the Passover, the feast of the unleavened bread and of the law of the firstborn. And this feast is still celebrated in the Jewish tradition as it is outlined here in Exodus, because remember, Exodus is a book about deliverance. It is a salvation book. It is a rescue book. And so the Jewish tradition or the Jewish faith is always about remembering. Always about remembering. And they remember this exact thing when God rescued them, when God brought them out and delivered them from the hands of the Egyptians. Now, as Christians, as Protestants, that's who we are, we still have a celebration of Passover, and it is called the Lord's Supper. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but this night has something to do with Passover. And so let's read Exodus 12, beginning at 1 through 5. And God is going to give them some specific instructions. And if you have been, yesterday was First Sunday, which means that for many of us, we shared in the Lord's Supper. And it has its beginning in this celebration of the feast of the Passover. So let's just read chapter 12, 1 through 5. It says, "Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's house, a lamb for each household. Now, if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one, according to the number of persons in them, according to what each man should eat. You are to divide the lamb. Your lamb should be an unblemished male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roast it with fire, both its head and its legs, along with its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left of it until morning you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The Lord shall be a sign for you in the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike Egypt. Okay, so there are some specific instructions, but I want to pay attention to the lamb. The lamb was not supposed to have any spot or blemishes. The lamb was supposed to be whole. The lamb was not supposed to, and each person was supposed to have a lamb for their household. But because this was a community event, or every Israelite was supposed to observe it, and if a household did not have a lamb, then they were to share. And so each lamb, they were going to cook it, and the blood, they were going to put it over their doorposts. They were going to put it over their doorposts. This lamb could not have any broken bones. It had to be no problems. It just had to be as pure and as whole as possible. Now, where else have we heard as Christians? Where do we know this lamb from? Where do we celebrate a lamb without spot or wrinkle? Now, that's a question that any of us can answer, especially if we had communion on yesterday or have been in any communion service in all of our Christian lives. We have heard about the lamb. The lamb was used as a substitute. Now, what's different for them and us is that every household had to have a lamb. Now, of course, we are after the cross, and we know that Christ is our lamb, our perfect lamb, without spot or blemish, who had no sin on him. And so God demanded that the Israelites obey him. Again, up until now, they've not had to do anything, but now they have to be active. So what was the purpose of letting Israel go? Was it just so that they could be free? But they were to be free so that they can serve God. God said, let my people go that they may serve me. As God's children today, we have learned through this great show of power that ultimately it will require active obedience to receive salvation from the one true God. Now, God is not asking us to put blood over our doorposts, but there is blood still makes a difference. Remember, they were to take the lamb and the blood, they were to put on their doorposts. Christ is our lamb, and we're not putting his blood on our doorposts, but it covers us, especially our hearts. So again, remember I told you a long time ago when we first started this study, you cannot effectively deal with the New Testament until you understand the Old. And so this whole thing about Passover is a precursor to the past. In fact, it was a Passover that Jesus was observing in the upper room on the before having to go to the trials and to be crucified. So if the Jews is all about remembering, and Christ was a Jew, he would have observed this meal. And so he says that all of those who have the blood over their doorposts, I'm going to pass over them. Now we come up with the word Passover, but the original word really means that he's gonna hover over, or he's gonna just kind of like linger there. But we have our English tradition says that it is the Passover. When I see the blood on the doorpost, I'm going to pass over. Now remember, if you can see this picture here, that the blood was supposed to only be on the doorpost. It was not supposed to be on the floor, at the bottom, or anything like that, because nobody, blood is considered life. And so the idea is that it could not be trampled over. Because there were no altars then, a person's house or this door was considered the altar. If you can just picture, no altars, but this door represented the house. And the smearing of the doorpost was a symbol of the altar. They could not put it on the door frame. They couldn't put it on the threshold because someone might walk over it. And the application of the blood was an act of obedience, that they were placing their faith in this Yahweh. Up until now, they still don't know a whole lot about Yahweh. They were a part of the Egyptian system, so they would have known about all of these other gods. Yet God is basically asking them to trust me. And by them doing it, God is going to preserve them. So in order to encourage the Pharaoh to free the Israelites, God intended to kill the firstborn of both men and beasts. And to protect themselves, the Israelites were told to mark their homes with lamb's blood so that God can identify and pass over their homes. Now that will preach right there. That will preach. God said, now today we're not putting it on the doorpost because our hearts are the altar. And so wherever God sees his son's blood, he says, that's one of mine. That's my child. I'm going to protect that one. I'm going to preserve that one. I can't identify that one because I see my son's blood. That's exactly, of course, now again, Christ is not, the Israelites would not have been thinking of Christ. But we know the end of the story. We can see Christ there, but for the Jews, that's not what they're going to see. Okay? I hope that you are getting this and it's making sense. Any questions or comments? Pastor Green.
Yeah, it would help us to remember that the ultimate Passover here is that everyone that was obedient to Moses' instruction to put the blood on the doorpost and the mantle and to stay in the house. You know, don't come outside to see what your neighbor's doing. Don't come out to see what the cry in the land is doing. Stay behind the protection of the blood.
My God.
For if we, you know, you could put the blood there and still come out. You know, some of us just skeptical. You hear a siren going, we get our back at scanning our camera. But he said, no matter what you hear, no matter what go on, stay in your house. Stay there. Eat, be ready to travel. Now, the cry was awesome. And as you said, parenthetically speaking, we have the New Testament, we have Jesus. But the history of the text was not a spiritual deliverance. This is a physical deliverance. It's a physical salvation from Pharaoh, his taskmasters, and God is going to lead his people through the help of Moses into their land, their promised land, their freedom, their place that flows with milk and honey. And the joy of this is, if we understand it, that it's God who freed us. Moses gave the instructions. Moses and Aaron were faithful, but it's God who did the deliverance. And Pharaoh, even after this, changed his mind. Even after his firstborn had died. The question was asked him by his staff, what have we done? Why did we let him go? And so he put together 600 chariots and got in hot pursuit to go get him, make him come back. Another mistake. And so as you unfold this story for us, Reverend Jackson, it's my prayer that each time we look at this, we see the historical significance that happened to get Jesus to Bethlehem, and from Bethlehem to Calvary. And then the first day of the week, and after 40 days departed, but he's coming again. If we can connect all the dots to see how the bloodline works, it's going to help everybody for years to come. And I really appreciate your patience and your faithfulness in working with us.
Thank you. If we could go down to Exodus 12, verse 29, after, as Pastor Green has said, is that Pharaoh still was unconvinced and refused to free the slaves until his own firstborn was killed. He says, now it came about midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captain. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants. They heard a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, rise up, get out from among my people, both of you and the sons of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have said. Go and bless me also. Now just think about that. Up until then, he just refused. Pharaoh just refused until his child was born, was killed. Remember what we said earlier is that sometimes it's always somebody else's problem until it hits our household. I can read about the flood that was in Boise or the flood that was, in Texas, because it's not at my front door. But if it was at my front door, then I want everybody to stop doing what they're doing, because I got water in my house. And so when it happened, Pharaoh was ready to tell them, say, take everything, y'all go. But at the end, he says, and bless me. At this point, Pharaoh has come to recognize that there is somebody bigger than him. That there is somebody bigger than him. And the Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said we will all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened with the kneading bowls bound up in cloths on their shoulders. Now remember, because they had to go so quickly, they did not have time to bake their to do everything they needed to do with their bread. And so that's where we get the term unleavened bread, because they did not have time to get the rising agents, the yeast or whatever in it. And so they had to bake their dough in a hot sun, and it just became basically crackers or unleavened bread, which thus is why at communion or the Lord's Supper, we have unleavened bread, or we have crackers or something to symbolize this time. Again, we don't celebrate the Passover as such, but we do celebrate the Passover, so to speak, because we did have a lamb who shed blood for our spiritual salvation. As Pastor Green has said, the Exodus story is about a physical salvation. Jesus Christ as the Lamb was about a spiritual salvation. So what is the result of these plagues? The Israelites were not only allowed to leave the land of Egypt, but they were commanded by Pharaoh to do so. And I kind of chuckle because now after all of the times where it could have been so simple as turning the water into blood, that, we could have just gone the first time, but God had to step it up every time. And hey, again, let's not be too hard on Pharaoh, because how many times have we don't heed the small things and God has to do something dramatic to get our attention? But the Bible says that there were 600,000 men besides children who left that night, and they were left enriched by the Egyptians. And we didn't talk about that. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But when they left, they took all kinds of jewels and gold and all of that from the Egyptians, because they were going to need that for their furnishings when they got ready to build their tabernacles. And we'll talk about that a little later. But this 10th plague, or the whole 10 plagues, basically ended 430 years of the children of Israel living in the land of Egypt. So it is this last plague, this 10th plague, that was the turning point. Now, at this point, the Hebrews were still not a nation. Remember, Abraham was promised he was going to be the father of many nations, but they are on their way to God shaping them to be the nation that he had promised. But they have been under Egyptian rule for 430 years. So even though they may be physically out of Egypt, mentally and emotionally, and even some spiritually, are still in bondage. So that is our lesson tonight.